All right, here's what we have left with Unit 2. We have 3 artworks that are Etruscan, and then the rest are going to be Roman. So our first Etruscan art that we're going to talk about is the Sarcophagus of the Spouses. And this is the year 520 BCE in terracotta. And just a reminder, terracotta just means clay. It's that red type of clay. All right, context. We're going to talk about Etruscans, right? So Etruscans are the people who lived in what is now called Tuscany, and it used to be called Etruria, which is where the name Etruscans comes from, before the Romans conquer. So they're there for about 500-ish years before Romans take over. And then this was found in the necropolis of tombs, carved into hollow mounds from tufa. And tufa is just a type of rock that's like compressed volcanic ash. That's where this was found. All right, and then a necropolis, if you haven't written this down, we should have this somewhere. This is a large cemetery with elaborate tombs. Pretty sure we've talked about necropolis before. In ancient Greek, the word necropolis meant city of the dead. All right, so here's an example of what the inside of an Etruscan tomb would look like. Thousands of Etruscan tombs have been found, and they all look very domestic-like an interior setting of a home. We have more information about their ways of death than about their ways of life, very similar to Egyptian culture. Romans destroyed most of the Etruscan art and literature to reduce the importance of the Etruscan kings who ruled the region. So we have no literature or history. The only artwork that we have from this society is what has been found and recovered in tombs. All right, function. I mean, if you read the title of this piece, I'm pretty sure you can come up with the function. So this was a sarcophagus. A sarcophagus is a fancy word for a coffin, or it's a fancy coffin. It's a coffin usually decorated with sculpture from an ancient civilization. We have this sarcophagus, and then we have a Roman sarcophagus. I think that's all the sarcophagi that we have. The 2 figures here act as the lid to the sarcophagus. And this would have held the ashes of the deceased. And then I wasn't sure where to put this, if this went for form or just information about the material. So terracotta, like I said, was clay. This was the preferred medium of the Etruscan sculptors. They did sometimes work in bronze, but most of what they preferred to work in that we know of is clay or terracotta. The Greeks, remember, we don't have any clay from the Greeks. We have marble and bronze. Most of the bronze was melted down, but they did work in bronze. All right, so where have we seen this style before? What does this remind you of? So now think about form, like when you're looking at their faces, their bodies, their hair, what does this recall? So hopefully you thought about archaic Greek. We had the Inavisios choros, that was the male, and then the Peplos chore, the female, or the maiden. So we're going to put this for context. The Etruscans traded with the Greeks, which brought Greek influence into art. So you can see it with Egyptians, right? The Greeks traded with the Egyptians, and you can see that influence on the art. It's the same for Etruscans. All right. How? So it's one thing to say in an essay, Etruscans traded with Greeks, which brought Greek influence in art. How is this visible? Why are you making this claim? What evidence do you have to back up this claim? So then you would start talking about the form, right? The similarities that they have. So you could say they both have that same archaic smile. They both have the same stylized braided hair and the almond-shaped eyes. And they both would have been brightly painted. All right, so obviously their hands look like they were holding something, but whatever they were holding no longer exists. So these are all guesses that art historians have made on what they could have been holding. Could have been small drinking vessel, maybe oil for anointing, like rubbing onto the dead. Could have been food, and it could have been something that they would have used for the journey to the afterlife. I think it's really interesting to note that these are life-size clay figures. These are really large. This was also found in about 400 pieces and has been reassembled, which is pretty cool to think about as a career, restoring, art restoration, restoring these pieces back together. And then as far as how was this fired, since it's clay, it has to be fired to a certain temperature in order to remain solid and hard and everything. So this was fired in 4 different pieces. So it would have been divided here and then divided horizontally to break apart. Also note for the form, there's a real lack of focus in the lower half of the body, right? There's all this attention to detail and sculpting, and then it's just legs under a blanket and then some feet popping out. So if you compare it, so we want to look at other artworks that are similar so that we can always compare for an attribution question. That's why I have the 2 artworks on the lower half of your note page. We're going to talk about those in a bit. All right, so for content, what are these both depicting? They're both very similar. So the 2 figures recline as equals, the male and the female. These are not portraits. The features are stylized. They are participating in a banquet, and we know that because of the tombs. So if you flip your note page over, oh, wait a second, never mind. So one of our other Etruscan artworks, number 32, is we're gonna be looking at the wall paintings like this, that's on tombs. And so you can see the very white figure is a female and the redder figure is a male. And again, those colors were used because the men worked outside, the women stayed inside. So that's what the colors referenced. But it's the same idea. It's reclining together as equals during a banquet, celebrating, moving on to the afterlife. All right, now think about the grave stele of Hergiso, right? How did this one depict how women were valued as citizens, right? They weren't citizens. So what did this talk about as far as relationships with men and women, if you were to compare the 2? How are women valued in Etruscan society compared to how are women valued in Greek society? So this information, by the way, I wrote down the bottom of my note page with these other 2 is where I wrote this. All right, and this is more context. So Etruscan ladies held a much higher place in society than the Greeks. Remember, Greek women were not thought of citizens. The Greek women were not even allowed to be depicted alongside a man. So this is very different. The idea of it horrified and threatened the Greco-Romans. That's just referred to as the Greek-Roman people, or the Greco-Romans. All right, attribution question. So these 2 artworks that I also have on your note page, these are both lids to 2 different sarcophagi. Attribute these pieces to a specific culture. So if we weren't just talking about the sarcophagus of the spouses, and you had an essay question that had one of these, what culture would you attribute these to? What are the identifying features that lead you to your attribution? That's saying stake your claim. Why are you saying that these are Etruscan? Or why are you saying these are Greek? Why are you saying these are Roman? What's your evidence to back up your claim? So here's a better look at them. By the way, the one on the left are the parents to the couple on the right. So the one on the left is older. I don't know the dates, so. All right, so we don't need to write all this down. If you want to write something on here, I think I added one thing to my notes that I thought was interesting to add. All right, so both couples are featured in loving embrace on the lid of the sarcophagus. The commemoration of an affectionate marriage for eternity reflects a major difference between the ancient Greek and the Etruscan societies, namely the more equal participation of women in Etruscan rituals and life. The son's sarcophagus on the right shows the influence of Greek art and styles in his beard and in his wife's hairstyle. Both couples wanted to remain in eternal embrace. So what I added to my notes, I said couples wanted to remain in an eternal embrace, which reflects the difference between the Greeks and the Etruscans. Also, I'd like to point out the little feet coming out below the blanket on the older sarcophagus on the left. Adorable.